Welcome to Reflections on Gaming, your weekly insight into everything gaming. This week we are going to be introducing a new segment, Overrated versus Underrated, wherein we offer our opinions on why two games are regarded the way they are in the industry at large, and why we think that should change. I'm Weston.
And I'm Jordan.
Okay, so today, like I said, we're starting our new segment, Overrated versus Underrated. And today, we wanted to pull from a franchise we've already, well, not a franchise, a genre we've already talked a little bit about, and we're going to analyze two different FPS franchises. We're going to look at Call of Duty, which we feel is overrated, and we're going to compare it with F.E.A.R, which we both feel is an underrated series.
Now, to be clear, this segment is not always going to be two games from the same genre, nor are we generally going to be saying these games are better than those games. The main point is just to talk about how there are many game franchises that tend to go under the radar with a lot of people that play games that should get a little bit more attention because they've done something interesting. They've done something that you can get a lot of entertainment out of. And also, we want people to be a little bit more critical of those highly acclaimed, quote-unquote, mainstream franchises, because if you're not critical of the entertainment you consume, you can be left in a place where you're not getting the most out of your free time. And we want people to have as much fun as they can. So, with that in mind, we're going to be talking a little bit about Call of Duty and a little bit about F.E.A.R. First, let's talk about Call of Duty. And before we talk about how it's overrated, first let's give you some background about what kind of game series Call of Duty is.
Call of Duty started in... the very first game came out in 2003, and it was just called Call of Duty. And in the beginning, Call of Duty was very focused on historical. The first few games were set during World War II, so that was kind of their focus for a long time. And as the series has progressed, of course, they've shifted a lot of that focus, and they've gone to very, very different time periods and play styles, and focused on very different things throughout the games. But it came out in 2003 for the PS3, the Xbox 360, and all of kind of the PC and the other consoles out around that era. And ever since then, other than 2004, during which they were developing Call of Duty 2, there has been a new Call of Duty game every single year, at least one every single year since 2005.
Yeah, sometimes there's more than one a year, which if you know much about the game industry, you should recognize that that is ludicrous, because most of the time game series take much more than a year to have new iterations. Sometimes series do come out very rapidly, especially if they reuse assets, which there's nothing wrong with, but to consistently churn out game after game after game, generally not a great look for a franchise, because it can really stagnate the audience. It can really be bad for developers, because either you have 2 or 3 development teams working on games simultaneously, which makes it very difficult to learn from past mistakes, or you have one team that is being killed with the rapid turnover cycle. So a yearly release is ridiculous and generally not seen favorably in the general audience.
Yeah, the only other games that really do that are sports games, which often run on the same engines and aren't expected to be super different. They're just expected to kind of update their rosters, teams, and stats and stuff. But for Call of Duty, players are expecting a lot of change, or if not a lot of change, at least meaningful change between titles. And so, like Jordan said, that is really, really rapid. And one of what I think is a likely result of this is that Modern Warfare 2, which is often, for a long time, was heralded as the very best the series had to offer, and nowadays is still seen as quite good. They even remastered the campaign just this year. It came out in 2009. Every single Call of Duty game that has come after it has scored lower than Modern Warfare 2 did. Now, they fluctuated. It hasn't gone down steadily since Modern Warfare 2. But the fact that a game in 2009, over 10 years ago, that they've had a lot of time to learn and experiment on, still scored higher than every single title that's come afterwards is somewhat telling.
And to be fair, scores are not the end-all be-all. We don't want to tell people that they should put too much weight in the score, and scoring tends to change over time. So a quote-unquote better game, which is very, very subjective, can be scored lower than a quote-unquote worse game, simply due to the people who were scoring it, or the current culture, or this, that, or the other thing. But the fact remains that Call of Duty is a fairly known quantity, so the scores do reflect very well how the games are being received by the general public. And quite frankly, a lot of that has to do with Modern Warfare focusing less and less on their main campaign and more on their multiplayer, and trying to get people to really buy into that. And the reason for that is because once you've sold a single player game, unless you have some DLC, that's it for revenue. Once you've sold a single player game, that's it. You cannot make more money off of that game. With a multiplayer game, there are several different avenues you have to generate additional revenue. One method is loot boxes, which we'll probably talk about eventually. Generally, we would regard them as predatory monetization practices. A less predatory, but still not necessarily great way to monetize would be with additional maps or other cosmetic items that you can buy straight up. And so in the multiplayer sphere, when you have people continually going back to the game and they want something new to entertain them, there's a lot of different avenues you have to continue monetizing off of that space. So Call of Duty, the Modern Warfare, Advanced Warfare, Future Warfare, all these different things in the franchise, while they have pushed forward by saying, hey, we put all this time and money and effort into the single player campaign, well, you know that it's not really their aim to make a solid single player experience when they're releasing a new game every single year. You just don't have the time to be able to really hammer home that stellar AAA experience that you're trying to sell to people. That's not to say that the stories haven't been good and that they haven't had some really unique and really fun mechanics added into it. It is just to say that it's obvious that this is a money-making game franchise rather than a franchise that's trying to push forward the medium in one way or another. And so there's certain pieces of the game that it's very clear that they cut corners, or that they're trying to do something just to get people to talk about it rather than really evaluating the impact of that moment in the game and on their players.
That's right. And, you know, the big difference between in multiplayer loot boxes and even things like cosmetic items, which, you know, is still not great because a lot of times it's marketed towards kids who don't. Yeah, it's a whole thing. We'll talk about it probably in the future. But with single player DLC, as a developer, the reward you get for putting in extra time is significantly less than just selling loot boxes or selling new weapons or selling new skins that take, you know, a graphic designer, like half an hour to slap together. And so,
well, okay, don't put down graphic designers. They have tough jobs. But your point is correct that it is much easier and you have a much larger profit margin on that kind of stuff.
yeah. And so what happens is that, and kind of the first point that I think that you covered a little bit is that when you're churning out games like this and the focus is on making money instead of making a really solid, well-rounded experience, a lot of the game suffers and the whole thing becomes very repetitious. And as you buy, and for some games, that's literally the point. Again, most other game series that release so rapidly are sports franchises that it's not supposed to be a different game. It's reflective of a real life game. Of course it's repetitious. It's the same every time you play it. That's literally the point. But with Call of Duty and just, the broader world of video games, you don't want to keep buying and playing the same game with a slightly different aesthetic, which is what Call of Duty has unfortunately often fallen into the trap of doing, is that it's, even when you play multiplayer, yeah, it might be slightly different maps, but you're doing the same thing in the same game modes with the same types of guns, even if they have different names and different looks. They do the same thing. And so you fall into this trap of, like you said, kind of wearing out your audience, or at least you'd think that it would wear out the audience as they keep buying and playing these games, because it's just the same experience every time. And a lot of times when they have put in things to try to set it apart from the rest of the series, like correct me if I'm wrong, Advanced Warfare added the jetpack mechanic, but it wasn't terribly well received by people. Is that the things that they've tried to do to keep it from becoming repetitious have not been the things that their players are looking for.
Well, and it's not necessarily good to try to pander to your audience. There's a lot of pitfalls that you can do there, because while people don't actually want the same thing over and over and over again, that's what they tend to tell you they want, which is very interesting psychology behind that. But before we get too into the weeds here, let's get back to talking about what Call of Duty is. So it's this yearly franchise. It's a first-person shooter. In the first-person shooter sphere or genre, it is closer to a realistic shooter in that in most of the games, the guns that you will be wielding are either real guns in the world or very closely based to real guns. You won't have, plasma cannons. You won't have auto-targeting rockets and all these crazy things. It is generally man-to-man combat, so very infrequently will you be trying to take on tanks or helicopters or anything like that, and very infrequently will you ever utilize any of those vehicles. It is mostly you on the ground, perhaps with a team, using guns to kill other combatants in interesting maps, and that's essentially what you have to go through. I say semi-realistic because it has a regenerating health system. You can't do that in real life. If you get shot, your bullet's not going to pop out in 5 seconds and be back to normal. You're not going to be able to sprint for 5 seconds and then be huffing and puffing for 20 seconds, unless you're unfortunately really out of shape. But the point is that these games originally came out and they were trying to be simulation style shooters. They wanted to emulate being in the trenches in World War I. Yes. They wanted to simulate you being there at D-Day and simulate all of these battles. Once we moved on to modern warfare, now they want it to be like you're in Afghanistan. You're fighting the Taliban with modern weaponry and whatnot. They eventually went to advanced warfare, which was slightly futuristic. Then they went to Future, which was way advanced, and a lot of people did not like it because of that, because a lot of the audience is still looking for those kind of grounded, more grounded, because let's face it, nothing in those games is really actually grounded, but more grounded. They want to play something where they feel like, yeah, I could actually do this. And it facilitates the fulfillment of a very specific power fantasy. So, with that in mind, most of the stories have been relatively grounded. But the Modern Warfare franchise, or set of games in the series, set a precedent for the future games that Modern Warfare has continued to follow, very much to its detriment. And this pattern has to do specifically with the story, and it is shocking moments. There are moments in the Modern Warfare games and beyond that are in the game specifically to shock the player. And what they want to do with these, well, I shouldn't say this is what they want to do, but what it seems they are attempting to do, and what most people are getting out of these shocking moments, is not some great highlight in the story or something very impactful, but it's just kind of a shock and awe that appears to be trying to garner attention. And let me explain what these moments are. In the first Modern Warfare game, there's a moment where a nuclear device goes off while the main character is flying away from a helicopter. And as the scene progresses, the player that you have been directing dies in this nuclear explosion, very slowly, because he wasn't close enough to be caught by the blast itself. When this came out, it was a highlight of the game, because before this, most games had not killed off a main character that you played as, and most games did not show you kind of the trauma of what happens when a giant bomb goes off, especially a nuke. This game did that, and so it garnered a lot of attention, and it was generally seen as a very positive thing in the story. Not, ooh, so cool, I'm gonna get killed by a nuke now, but something where it's like, hey, people haven't done this before, and we'd love to see more of that. Well, it's too bad they said that, because future games started putting in these shocking moments, and they're there just to be shocking. And I'll let Weston talk about some of those.
Yeah, I think, just real quick, like you said, the nuke in the first game was actually a pretty solid moment, because like you said, nobody had done it before. And, frankly, those are the kinds of things that happen in war. And they do happen, and I think it did elucidate some of those things, that it's like, yeah, you're playing this game, but, in real life, these things happen, and in real life, the heroes don't always get out, But then when they started to kind of capitalize on that, it's like, oh, well, this wasn't just like a cool thing to put in that we thought was like meaningful. It's also a game seller. So let's, put it in and get people to talk about the game, so more people will want to buy the game to play it. And that's when it really started to go downhill. So one of the other scenes was in Modern Warfare 2. You take control of a seemingly random person, and you're in an airport. And as you walk out into the airport at this terminal where there's tons of people waiting in line to get their tickets or go through security, one of the other people in your group says, remember, no Russian. So, it kind of reveals, oh, you're Russian operatives in this airport, but your goal is not to like sneak through or get to somewhere else in the airport or get onto a flight that you're not supposed to be on to get somewhere in America as like espionage. No, you go in with machine guns and you just mow down the entire crowd in the airport, and you just kill all these civilians. Which didn't like it just kind of happened. You didn't know who you were. You didn't know really much about what was going on other than the fact that you were Russians who were obviously antagonists in the game, and you were killing all these civilians, and then it went back to the normal game. So it didn't play any real story purpose other than, hey,
Well,
there's
hold on
bad
there.
guys.
It did have a story purpose in that the character you played as was an undercover operative, and he actually is killed at the end, not because they found out who he was, but because they wanted to leave a Russian there so that they could feign that it wasn't them who did it, and have cause to start this world war that is kind of the basis of the game. But the point stands that they could have done this in a lot of different ways, but they chose to specifically create a level where you mow down civilians and then you mow down police officers, and that is the entire level. In the beginning of the level, there is even an option to skip the level, and that should tell you that they really wanted this to garner as much attention and controversy as possible, to get people talking about the game, to get people buying the game. But the moment itself is less impactful and more of kind of a numb, like, you're going from something that was super surprising that you'd never seen before to suddenly, hey, let's just mow down hundreds of civilians and see what kind of controversy we can get from that. It is not impactful, it's not important, it is pure shock factor, and it's a little disappointing that we're still talking about it, because the people who made the decision to put that in the game got what they wanted. People bought the game. People are still talking about that scene, in spite of the fact that it's not a good one. It's just shocking.
Right, and again, we're not saying that these moments inherently in video games are bad. Like we said, the nuke in the first game was, it at least felt like it had something to say, even if there was the idea that they wanted to stir up controversy and get people talking about it. There was at least some reason for it to happen, and it was impactful. Whereas if you continue to do that and it becomes obvious that you're doing it just for the sake of getting talked about, it begins to lose pretty much any message that could have been underlying it. Which is, as a game developer and as gamers, you don't want to see that happen, because those things should not be just capitalized on to get your game sold.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that they didn't really learn their lesson, because in Modern Warfare 3, there's a scene where you go from, a fight to suddenly you're in the middle of an urban European city. It's very nice. You see a little girl on the sidewalk, and it's like, why am I in a civilian location in a war game that's all about me shooting people? And then, a bomb goes off, and oh my goodness, the little girl gets blown up right in front of you. How tragic. And it's terrible that they keep putting in these moments that are there just to shock the player and shock the audience, and it doesn't really add anything to the story. You can have shocking moments in your story, but if it doesn't feel deserved, if it feels like, you're just throwing something in there to hurt me, it feels very contrived. And future games have continued to put these in there. I have not been following the series after Modern Warfare and Advanced Warfare, but I have seen the controversies that have come out from the continued usage of these moments where something happens and it's just very shocking, and it doesn't feel like, oh yeah, that was totally warranted and now I'm super invested. It feels like, what the heck is happening? Like, why? You just kill that person in front of me for fun? Like, what's the point?
I think one other thing I would say, just to several of the Call of Duty games also have torture scenes, which I think falls definitely under this same thing. which is ridiculous because, frankly, in real life, as has been shown by many, many, many studies, is that torture doesn't actually work. So if it works in a game, like, if you're trying to put off a realistic vibe, that doesn't really fit. And B, again, it's just the shock factor, and people talk about these torture scenes, but there's so many other ways that you could go about accomplishing the same things, but they decided to go about it in the most grisly, gruesome way that they could to get people talking about the game.
Right, and we don't want to spend all our time bashing Call of Duty. We also don't want to give off the impression that we think these games are bad, because it manages to sell millions of copies every year because they are quality games. They're fun. They tend not to have too many bugs, right? They have value. They have quality. We just wanted to make the point that there are issues in them, and these issues need to be called out, and you as a consumer need to really think about, is this what I want to invest my time in? Just before shifting over to F.E.A.R, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about real quick. One, Call of Duty has this trope/tradition of having you go through a very short kind of obstacle course where you shoot cardboard cutouts, and then based on how quickly you get through that, they'll recommend a difficulty for you. This is stupid. First of all, you shouldn't bar your player from playing a higher difficulty unless you are making significant changes based on the difficulty, such as enemy placement, enemy AI, and items like that. Call of Duty doesn't do that. The differences between the difficulties are how much damage you can take and how many enemies there are. So the higher the difficulty, the more times you're likely to die, just because you didn't see an enemy and they got you in their sights. So it's really quite silly that they're going to do that. It's also silly that they use that because it has literally nothing to do with the main gameplay. The game does not become easier. You are not more skillful with how quickly you get through a level, right? And especially since there's many levels where you are stuck on rails, fighting off people, and you have to wait for things. So it just seems very odd and silly that they would do that. And it also, just the main campaign, as fun as they are sometimes, it's obvious that the game's main balancing focus is on the multiplayer, because if you go to higher levels on the main campaign, you'll die in seconds, unless you can pinpoint exactly where enemies are and shoot them very quickly. Now, perhaps I'm just not great at first-person shooters, though I tend to get through them very quickly, so I would contest that statement. But for argument's sake, let's say that I'm just not good at the game. The fact of the matter is, if you don't make any changes to your game except for health and damage values, then there's really not much of a point in changing the difficulties. And I would say that applies to every single game in existence where that is the case. Very infrequently is a slight adjustment of a couple of values a good justification for changing in difficulties. I think eventually we'll talk more on that and how you can have an effective difficulty scaling. But fact of the matter is, most games have really crappy difficulty scalings, and it doesn't matter what difficulty you decide to play on. It's your game. You play the way you want to have fun. Don't let people take away your fun just because they think that you're not good enough because you don't play on ultra hardcore or whatever. Like, screw them. They can be part of their Chad club. I don't care.
Yeah. At the end of the day, to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about, we feel that Call of Duty is overrated because the good parts of the game are good and they're polished, but there are bad parts that don't get talked about. And that's really what it comes down to. And I think that will be probably a somewhat recurring theme in a lot of these things, is that overrated games get by on their good values and people talk about the good things a lot more than they talk about the negatives. And we're just trying to elucidate some of those negatives and say how, like, look, if you continue to ignore these negative aspects, they're not going to get fixed. If they never get talked about, they're never going to get fixed. And the game will remain, in our opinion, overrated because those things aren't getting fixed and people are only talking about what makes the game great.
Right. The fact that a game has good qualities does not excuse the bad qualities. I think in an upcoming episode, we're going to talk about Breath of the Wild, and I think that will be the best way to illuminate the exact point that we want to make. But we don't want to get stuck up on there. Now we want to be a little bit brighter and cheerier and talk about a game that we think is underrated, a game that scored lower and has far fewer sales than Call of Duty, in spite of the fact that we feel like it is much more worthy of players' time than Call of Duty. And that series is F.E.A.R, spelled F.E.A.R, because it's supposed to be an acronym for First Encounter Assault Recon. Does that make a lot of sense? No. Does it matter? Not at all, because F.E.A.R is a cool title.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Marvel Shield. I don't even remember. We just watched I just watched Iron Man, and it's just crazy long. But yeah, acronyms, fun times. Anywho, F.E.A.R is also a first-person shooter like Call of Duty, but it is much more focused on single player than Call of Duty is. And it's also classified as a horror game. I mean, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the first F.E.A.R title came out in 2005. It also came out on the PS3 and that generation's consoles. Unlike Call of Duty, there are only 3 F.E.A.R games, main titles. There are a couple of spin-offs, a couple of downloadable titles, but there's really only 3 main titles that are really worth talking about. And the series came out between 2005 and 2011. All of them were available on PC and console, and all of them were regarded as okay games, but they also garnered a niche following. There's a forum all about them that has a lot of support of a lot of people wanting to revive the series. But we're going to talk about, why we think that it doesn't exactly get the praise that we feel like it should. It doesn't get talked about the way that we feel like it should, especially in contrast to the way that Call of Duty is talked about.
Right, and of course, this discussion is mostly within the mainstream. Obviously, there are people not in the mainstream that don't like Call of Duty, and people not in the mainstream that love F.E.A.R, and blah, 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 blah. But we're trying to just show this off to kind of the layman.
Yeah.
So F.E.A.R, the idea behind it is that it's kind of this first-person action/horror game. And that is part of the reason it is not as highly regarded, for 2 reasons related to the horror aspect. First and foremost, horror in any genre tends to do worse than action-adventure. Just horror is in of itself a more niche genre. Yes, it's very large. Tons and tons of people love it. But in just general, there's far more people interested in comedy, action, drama, romance, these kinds of things than horror. On top of this, specifically for F.E.A.R, it wasn't really that scary of a game franchise. Now, it had moments that are terrifying, but for the most part, it is more an action shooter with horror scenes and some creepy moments than a straight-up horror game. And because of that, because it was touted as horror, a lot of people marked it down because it wasn't scary enough.
I think just really quick to kind of expand on that for people who maybe aren't familiar with horror games. The thing that I'd say as somebody who really, really enjoys horror games and has played quite a number of them, in F.E.A.R, what Jordan means by creepy moments is that there are moments that are meant to scare you, but you're almost never actually in danger during those moments. Whereas in other horror games, especially survival horror games, which this technically they classified this under it, even though I don't think that's necessarily correct. In survival horror games, the moments that scare you are also the moments where you're most likely going to die. And the reason that's important is because with fear, even though there are those creepy moments, you eventually kind of become desensitized to them because you realize, oh, any time that there's something really scary going on, like any creepy imagery, I'm most likely not actually in danger. And I personally felt that way mostly through Fear 1 and 2, and Fear 3 did a little bit more with that concept, but I didn't mean to cut you off, so continue on with what you were saying.
No, that's perfectly all right. But in any case, I feel it is unjust to mark something down because it's not as high a quality of, in your opinion, of what it touts. For example, if you're looking at a children's television show and critiquing it for an adult audience, you're going to probably give it a low score, right? Because it's like, hey, here's this show, I'm watching it and I think it's garbage. Well, it's not for you. It's for kids, so you need to look at it from their perspective and figure out if they would like it. For Fear, it had a horror tag on it, but it wasn't just horror. It was horror action. Well, people kind of ignored the action and they're like, well, it's not scary, so I'm marking it down. It's like, well, it's horror action. You can say that the horror isn't that scary, that's fine, but don't just mark it down because it's not scary enough. Anyway, it's an interesting kind of balancing act to figure out what things you should give some leeway towards in a game and what things you shouldn't. And I'd say that if a game has something in it that isn't brought to its peak, but it doesn't detract from the experience, then it's a good thing. For example, Fear. The horror wasn't super scary, but it wasn't bad. There was creepy moments. There was moments that really gave you that shudder, and you didn't know what was going to happen next. And it elevated the experience. It didn't elevate it as much as it could have, or perhaps should have, but it did elevate it. Whereas in Call of Duty, those shocking moments brought the experience down because it felt out of place, and it felt like they were just trying to get a reaction out of you rather than trying to add to the story and not sticking the mark. Hopefully that makes sense, but I just want to be clear. We're trying not to be hypocritical here in looking at things that are overrated versus underrated, in spite of the fact that we might praise one game for something it didn't do well, and say this game didn't do this well and it should be dinged for it. That's the reason why we'll praise one versus detract another. It's because if it elevates the experience, it's good. But just because it's there, you have to decide whether it elevates it or it detracts from it. And in Fear's case, I feel that it was unwarrantedly regarded as taking away from the experience when it didn't.
Right, and the problem comes with both overrated and underrated games. To kind of tie this together, is that the problem comes in when you say this thing is true, because in general, what it should be instead is this thing is true, but. So Call of Duty has great multiplayer, but, and in this case, yeah, Fear isn't that scary, but, and then you kind of go off from there, and that's a problem. A lot of people don't even bother to add on to qualify that statement with like, but it also does all these things not very good, or it also does a lot of these things really good, which are some of the things we want to talk about with Fear. And one of those things is that for a 2005 game, especially for like a brand new franchise, Fear had a very, very smart AI and a very well built AI that was very challenging, in that people would your enemies would flank you if you were too focused on shooting their allies up on a wherever. A couple of people might make their way through the building behind you and flank you, and you end up having to kind of protect yourself on both sides, and a lot of other things that the enemies won't just stand there and take it. They also won't just kind of stay behind cover forever. It was very realistic, relatively realistic AI that made the game feel very fun and dynamic.
I think the big thing is that the AI in F.E.A.R isn't necessarily incredibly intelligent from a human's perspective, but compared to essentially every other first-person shooter game ever, including games that came out after F.E.A.R, the AI is so much simpler that it's very easy to game it. In the F.E.A.R franchise, that's not so much the case. Enemies will jump out of the way, they'll flank you, they'll duck under cover, they will dive for cover, they'll communicate of who needs to open the door, whether they're going to breach, and all these different things that in the end are relatively simplistic, but they allow for a game experience that cannot be had anywhere else. And thankfully, the AI systems have been discussed ad nauseum online by a number of very talented creators to highlight just how incredible this system was and why it was so engaging to play with. And on that merit alone, I would say that the game is worth playing, but that's not the only reason the game and the series is good. To be fair, only the first game has such a robust AI system. The second and third game are not as good, but they're still slightly better than most other franchises. But in the first game, that AI is just amazing. Anyone who's interested in a very interesting first-person shooter experience should definitely jump on it just for that. But on top of that, the gunplay gives you a feeling of power that most games, especially set in a more realistic setting, could never achieve. The sound effects and the animations just from firing your weapons make it feel like it's extremely powerful. The ragdoll effects that occur once you've defeated an enemy and a couple of bullets hit them because you've been emptying your mag or whatever, there's a slight delay between firing and realizing they're dead. Like, different pieces of their body react and jerk based on where you hit them with a bullet. They also implemented an extremely intelligent texturing system on all of their walls that allowed for lots and lots of high quality bullet holes being shown based on the lighting where it comes in. So if you shoot a wall, in most games, you will see a bullet hole mark, and it's very clear that it's just a bullet hole mark. In F.E.A.R, rather than having bullet holes, it would look like an entire chunk of concrete was ripped off because of the impact of the bullet. And there's a couple of places online where you can look deeper into the logistics of how they did that. Very interesting from a design perspective. But when you're playing the game, what it makes you feel like is this gun that I'm toting has real power. It's not just putting this piddly little hole in the wall. No, it is ripping things apart, and I'm hitting enemies with this. It's a very cathartic feeling, and it really helps the game stand out amongst its peers in that so many games you play from the first person perspective let you shoot people. Very few of them really distinguish themselves from others in how that feels, and F.E.A.R feels unlike any other game you've played.
Yeah, F.E.A.R has a very very strong gunplay. Like Jordan said, it just seems like the developers of F.E.A.R really took care with the details in that game. It's very detail oriented. The AI, they'll do smart things relatively. Again, the story itself is very cohesive and leads, every piece of it leads intelligently to the next piece, and any twists and turns you come upon along the way are things that are explainable within the universe, and when you play it through again, you realize that some of the hints have been dropped along the way, which is something I think is really important and something that really elevates stories, because a lot of stories have twists, obviously, but not all stories have twists that are discernible, that you could have possibly worked out at least pieces of it throughout the game because of how things happened, or because of environmental things, or just because of other backstory or hidden content that you could have found. And I'm a big fan of that, especially in, in horror games. I think that's especially a strong thing, because horror games generally have some kind of twist to them, and I think it's important that that everything is cohesive within the game, that the gameplay makes sense with the story, and that the story makes sense throughout the game, and that you're not just kind of left there like, oh, well, that was weird, or that was dumb, or I don't understand how I got here. Like, I don't even understand how I got from point A to point B, which is definitely a problem that some games run into. So I think that F.E.A.R, just as a whole experience, is really good. Not just all of its individual pieces, but everything is obviously tailored to work together.
Right, and so while certain things have changed between the first, second, and third game, the overall feeling that they give off is very similar. For example, in the third game, there are enemies that are just psychotic. They throw knives at you, or they strap bombs to their chests and try to kill you, purely because they've gone insane. And there is a character you can use that allows you to control these people, and if you hit an enemy with a knife that they're throwing with all their strength, you can pin people to the walls. And there's not a lot of games that let you do that with that kind of impact, which, obviously a bit of a morbid thing to talk about. But when you're playing a game, that feeling of impact is one of the most important things you can have. So the F.E.A.R series has, throughout the entire three games, really done a great job of being impactful, both in the gameplay and the story. There's only a couple of times in the story where there's something where you're like, oh, that seems like just kind of a, they threw that in there to try to be interesting and didn't really land super well. For example, in the third game, once you get to the end, there is a fight between the two characters that you can play as, and depending on who had a higher score throughout the game, they'll win the fight. A little bit contrived, doesn't really matter. It does make sense based on their characters and what they've been saying throughout the game, but it didn't really land as well as it could. But I think we've probably given enough evidence as to why you should evaluate playing this game if you are interested in playing it for the single-player content. Now I want to talk about the multiplayer content, because the first and the third game did some things that no other game has ever done, and I think that's a travesty, because both of them have managed to do something that is just extremely interesting, and really change up the genre. The first game in the multiplayer had just the regular, deathmatch, team deathmatch, capture the flag, conqueror, all those things. But one of the main mechanics in the series is the ability of the main character to slow down time. In the game, it's not really slowing down time. It's you are just moving so quickly, everything seems to slow down for a couple of seconds. Well, they managed to put that into the multiplayer of the first game. And I don't know how they managed to get it to work, but it's one of the most interesting experiences, because they have put in this system that could potentially completely break the game by just making it the first person who sees someone and hits that slow motion wins. But it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's an idea that has never been done again. And it's just unfortunate because it's such an interesting idea. It's something that, if you're interested in something a little out of the norm, you could get a lot of fun out of using that slow motion in multiplayer.
Yeah, I haven't actually played the multiplayer, but I can imagine that it would, like, that was one of my favorite things about the single player campaign was the reflex is what it's called mode, where you slow down, and it would be very interesting to do that in multiplayer. F.E.A.R 3 had an interesting, I haven't played the competitive multiplayer, but part of what Jordan was talking about of like the two characters fighting at the end was that you could do the entire story co-op, where one person controlled one of the characters who was just normal, had guns, had grenades, that kind of stuff, and the other person controlled the one who can possess other people. And so you can kind of, it's one of the most interesting co-op ideas I've ever heard of, because most co-op is just two people with, if not exactly the same, similar capabilities. But in this case, somebody could possess somebody and bring them into view of the other character to kill. And it just encouraged working together in a lot different ways than most co-op campaigns would.
Right, that co-op in of itself is a great experience if you have someone to play it with. But the third game also had a plethora of gaming modes, one of which was called F.E.A.R Run. And I'm not censoring that. That's literally what it was called, F.E.A.R Run. And in it, the point of that mode was you and up to, I believe, 5 other people, so 6 people, had to run away from this massive wall that would kill you as soon as it touches you. So you'd be going through these corridors and these levels, and you'd have to take on all these different characters, or all these different enemies. And if any one of your companions got hit by the wall, you all failed. And so it created this tension that's unlike any other game multiplayer mode that I've played, because you take the zombie mode from Call of Duty or any kind of wave-based shooter, and it's similar in that if your friend dies, well, now it's just harder for everyone else, and so you're trying to keep everyone alive, you're trying to revive people and make sure that you're really being a good team player. Well, this took that to the extreme where if you leave someone behind, you're all screwed. But you all have to be competent enough to get through each shooting gallery at a rapid enough pace to outrun this wall. And again, it's one of those multiplayers that I'm really sad no one else has really implemented that, because if they did, I might be interested in trying more multiplayer games, because I'm not big into competitive multiplayer. I much prefer cooperative multiplayer. But that kind of thing, I had a lot of fun with the people that I got to play that with. And, it's yet again another little thing that we want to say. If you haven't played F.E.A.R, or if you've heard of F.E.A.R and haven't really given it the time of day, give it the time of day now. You can get it on Steam currently. You can still get it on PlayStation. And they are some of the most interesting shooters that you can really experience, and they're not like other contemporary shooters. So they're very much worth the money and the time that you can spend on them.
That's right. And if you disagree with us, that's okay. In fact, we welcome that, and we'd love to hear from you. Whether you disagree with us about thinking Call of Duty is overrated, or if you think F.E.A.R is not underrated, or if you have any other thoughts about other games that you think are overrated, underrated, that you want us to talk about, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at reflectionsongaming@gmail.com and reflect with us on all of these things. And we'd love to hear any thoughts that you have. And you never know, you might get a response from us, or you might even get featured on the show.
And before we head out, let's just mention a couple other first-person shooter franchises that we think might be underrated or overrated. I'll start. Halo. Oh, what am I gonna say? It's both. Halo is both overrated and underrated. Halo, the first 3 in the franchise, are ever so slightly overrated, right? People look at them like they're God's gift to first-person shooting. And while they're great, and I have them all, and I've beaten them all multiple times, and I thoroughly enjoy them, I don't think they're quite as good as people tend to say. As for underrated, 4 and 5. Just played those recently. Fantastic games. Play very, very well. And while they definitely have their low points, after having played all 5 games back to back, I can honestly say that they all have their pros and cons. And I think that 343 Studio is getting a little bit too much flack with their new forays into Halo.
Along the same line of thinking, BioShock, I think BioShock 1 is fairly overrated because it was interesting and it did do a lot of new things that were cool and the story was good, but the gunplay, which is, the entire game, not that great, not that inventive. BioShock 2 doesn't get talked about nearly as much as it probably should because it took a lot of the things from BioShock 1 but balanced them a little bit better. And BioShock Infinite, I think, is somehow both, depending on who you're talking to. I don't feel like there's a, from all of the things I've heard about it online, I personally really like it. But I recognize some people praise it as more than it maybe should, and some people don't think there's any redeeming factors about it either, and I think that's pretty silly as well. So I'd say...
Well, I think we should talk about that one eventually, because I am one of those people that, after having played it a couple of times, I've gotten to the point where I think it's probably the worst in the franchise.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about it. I'm not sure I agree, so that would be interesting to hear your viewpoint on that. But I think those are all games. I think they're all worth playing, and I think you should go into them with as little bias as possible, because they're all enjoyable. There's just some of them that are talked about more than they should be, and some that are talked about a little bit less than they should be.
Or at least in a more positive or less positive light than they ought to be.
Yeah.
Other franchises that I think are overrated. Killzone, probably right now, is underrated, especially since it's been on hiatus ever after Shadowfall. I've played a number of those games, and just like F.E.A.R, it's a series where when you play it, it's very distinctive. The feel of the gunplay, the art direction and everything. It's got its problems, and I'd say that, between F.E.A.R and Killzone, I'd suggest you play F.E.A.R, but if you can do both, you should definitely check out Killzone, because each of those games has been pretty impactful.
If there's anybody who's listening who wants us to talk about any of these games more in depth, we might do it eventually, but if you write into us, we might bump it up a little bit in our queue. So again, send us an email. We'd love to hear any thoughts you have about these games that maybe we can consider if and when we eventually talk about them.
Yeah, but with that, we thank you for joining us for this week's episode. We hope you liked it, and we hope you tell us if you liked it or if you hated it, so that we can continue to improve. Thanks for being here, and we hope you listen in next time.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.